Hello and welcome to Movie Marathon Mood. It's the show where we watch a bunch of movies and then we talk about them. It's as simple as that. On this episode, we continue with part 6 of Mel Brooks' film career with two films produced by his company, Brooks Films. The first, a comedy inspired by his years with Sid Caesar, My Favorite Year, and the second, a dramatic rendering of a tragic Hollywood story with Francis. It's a lot to talk about, and it's all right here on Movie Marathon Mood, which starts right now. Hi, everyone. I'm Jesse Gilstrap, and both of this episode's movies are ones that I watched for the first time here with little expectation behind them, except briefly learning of their tonal differences. My favorite year is comedic, sometimes raucous adventure, and Francis is a dramatic character study. What I didn't necessarily expect is that they would actually make for an interesting double feature. I chose to do this look into Mel Brooks' film career with a series of double features, partially because of the very beginning, where the second part could be an episode with Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein together. That much made sense, but it is otherwise an arbitrary decision. I could have just as easily chosen triple features, but so it goes. And yet, both of these films are set in the past and they center around big Hollywood stars with personal problems. Both films have questions as to their veracity, though My Favorite Year is at least treated as a work of fiction. But the way either central star is treated by the world around them is quite telling. My Favorite Year follows a drunken male star of the silver screen in his later years, and the crowds all adore him, and everyone still wishes to work with him regardless of how much of a trouble starter he is. Frances follows a defiant female cinema star who everyone treats like garbage as she speaks her mind, driving her into drinking, having a nervous breakdown before the industry and society overall pushes her away. If Frances Farmer had been a man, it's likely that her story could be quite different, at least in terms of how people treated her at times. But more on Francis after we discuss My Favorite Year. The questionable veracity I spoke of revolves around Mel Brooks's claim that Errol Flynn was on Your Show of Shows while Brooks wrote for that program. My Favorite Year revolves around a guest host inspired by Flynn on a popular television show that's inspired by, yes, Your Show of Shows, with a show staffer inspired by Brooks and fellow writer Woody Allen attempting to corral the out of control movie star, but many have questioned whether Errol Flynn ever was on Your Show of Shows. Brooks claimed that he was, and he certainly should know, but others have disputed this. And in spite of lots of records about which guests were on the program, no record shows that Flynn ever was on the program. There are very few actual film records of Your Show of Shows since this was in an early time of television and record keeping was not their top priority to such a frequently produced program. It would have been a lot of episodes to keep in a vault somewhere, but it at least seems true that Errol Flynn was very much like the star at the center of My Favorite Year. And if he wasn't on Your Show of Shows, he seems to have behaved like this on another show. To be even more fair, the plot of My Favorite Year revolves around this movie star named Alan Swan and how his drunken exploits might prevent him from being on the show in the first place. Writer Benji Stone attempts to keep Swan in check, but Swan has a mind of his own and easily might not make it to showtime. In this movie, Swan does end up being on the show, giving the film a happy ending. But what if Errol Flynn never actually made it onto Your Show of Shows? And what if this movie just represents the happy ending that Brooks and company would have liked to see from Flynn? That is certainly plausible, and it would explain why no record exists of Errol Flynn ever being on Your Show of Shows. And if this was a true story, which it obviously isn't trying to be, then the drunken Hollywood star would have controversy around him, been a bit of a fallen icon, and it wouldn't be that long before he drunk himself to an early death at 50 years old. That wouldn't make for much of a fun film. But My Favorite Year, very much a fun film, and whatever its inspirations, it is at the least a terrific nod to Brooks's years on a sketch comedy television show, and yes, to the power of myth. It helps as well that this Errol Flynn inspired character is being portrayed by Lawrence of Arabia's Peter O'Toole. O'Toole, nominated for an Oscar here, quite deservedly, in a year that Ben Kingsley ultimately won for Gandhi. O'Toole, phenomenal. On one level, being a believably charismatic leading man, all while causing trouble with his antics. But on another level, for managing to show the troubled man underneath the star. There are plenty of moments where we can see Alan Swan's humanity and heartbreak for the mistakes of his past, where his fear bubbles to the surface. O'Toole manages to make this all work, but also in a way that continues to be dashing and fun. Meanwhile, Mark Linn-Baker of The End of August plays Benji Stone, the staff writer trying to keep the unruly star in check, which is an impossible task. But Linn-Baker is terrific in his own right as a likable leading character attempting to keep his job and his family life all together. Linn-Baker is a suitable pick for this part, the future star of sitcom Perfect Strangers, entirely adept at being funny and pleasant in the middle of anarchy. He holds his own in a part inspired by legends like Mel Brooks and Woody Allen, but I feel that he simply makes the part his own. The chemistry between our two leads is terrific, all while the supporting cast keeps the film so viscerally alive on its edges, with the likes of Jessica Harper from Suspiria or Joseph Bologna of The Big Bus, and an Oscar nominee for writing Lovers and Other Strangers. It makes sense to populate this behind the scenes world of a comedy show with strong writers. There's also Bill Macy of The Jerk, a film made, of course, by Brooks's pal, Carl Reiner. My favorite year is full of lively performers like these that help us buy into this world. The film is the first feature for director Richard Benjamin, who does a terrific job of setting the stage and allowing the film to exist with such an ideal tonality that is zany, wild, never too crazy though, with just enough humanity to give the film its heart. No small task to balance all of those different ideas into a singular kind of tone. As to the writing of this film, Dennis Palumbo of The Love Boat is credited with the story and for writing the script, while Norman Steinberg of Blazing Saddles is also credited with the script, which suggests that Palumbo first took a stab at it and then Steinberg worked on the final draft of the script. Palumbo could be a terrific writer, no doubt, but Steinberg's legacy with Blazing Saddles certainly is a good suggestion of helping the script out a good deal. Regardless, this is a sharply constructed film. Excellent dialogue being thrown around left and right. There's all types of zingers and quotable lines. The story itself is relatively simple, but the way in which it is so fiercely entertaining and believable is credit to the writing. Cinematographer Gerald Hirschfield of Young Frankenstein does a first-rate job here of showing us all this anarchy in a way that is clear and classical. It's a very good-looking film that works in a cinematic way with so much mayhem, and that's also credit to Richard Chew, the editor of this film, as well as having edited Star Wars and The Conversation. The fast pace of the film is never too much as we are locked in with our main characters. Oscar winner for All That Jazz Ralph Burns supplies the zingy score, and a production design from Charles Rosen of Invasion of the Body Snatchers ideally captures the sets of sketch comedy from the 1950s and the behind-the-scenes tight corridors and offices. Up and down the crew of this film, top-notch talent, known for so many other excellent work, here working on a should-be classic film that has been, I believe, undersung all of these years. This film was a discovery for me. It hit so many of my interests, all in such a remarkable package. I was already enjoying myself thoroughly, but when the finale came, as Swan makes it out onto the stage, it worked as a fantasy adventure and emotional catharsis. I realized how invested I was in this tale when Swan swoops in to save the day, quite literally with the audience not realizing the fight that they're watching is a real brawl. It's absurd, but given the spirit of the film, it works. I give my favorite year an A plus. I'm already looking forward to watching it again sometime in the future. If I had a nitpick, definitely a nitpick, it would be the text on screen at the end that tells us of a reunion that we don't get to actually see. And yet, I also don't know that we need to see it either. Part of the joy of the film is that it feels recognizably human while being such an off the rails comic fantasy. What is definitely not comic fantasy is Francis, based on the real life of Francis Farmer, and yet also not entirely based on reality either. An unsuccessful lawsuit was actually filed against Brooks Films by William Arnold, the author of Shadowland. That book, Shadowland, claimed to be a nonfiction biography of Francis Farmer, but as has been revealed, it is riddled with inaccuracies, entirely invented, bogus claims. The most egregious of these claims is that Francis Farmer was lobotomized, which she was not. She faced plenty of abuse and struggles. She was in psychiatric care in a particularly unenlightened time, but no evidence supports the idea that she was lobotomized, and plenty more evidence says that Farmer absolutely was not lobotomized. Part of the interest in the lawsuit against Brooks Films that the author claimed in court that his book was, in fact, a fictionalized version of Francis Farmer's life. He had to claim this to prove that the screenwriters took from his book rather than from any fact. The filmmakers originally talked about adapting Shadowland, but decided to not directly adapt Shadowland except for, unbeknownst to them, details that were invented for that text. And yet, in spite of this, the book and this film have gone on to be seen as evidence of what happened to Francis Farmer in spite of these glaring inaccuracies. This, of course, presents a problem when it comes to assessing the film, which existed at that point in a world that believed Farmer's life as described in Shadowland. I don't believe there was ill intent to be inaccurate by the filmmakers, even if there absolutely was by the book's author. But the film should exist with the disclaimer that the real life Francis Farmer is not represented by this film, at least not entirely. There are parts that exhibit truth, for sure, but the parts that are inaccurate just jump out so strongly. It's also worth bringing up that Shadowland might have also been written as a support for Scientology to showcase how psychiatry is a bad pursuit. With so many real life horror stories, it is strange to fictionalize a popular person for these purposes. Regardless, Farmer is a compelling figure as a bright woman that burned too brightly, that had her own psychiatric issues, but this also seems to be, at least in part, a response to the way she was treated. She didn't like the control and expectations placed on her by the system, as in the Hollywood system, where she starred in several films before wanting to do theater. Certainly, she wished for creative freedom and to be treated as a serious actress, but these didn't seem to be things that went her way. This is also from the 1930s into the 1950s, eventually, for the latter part of her life and career, with her institutionalization happening in the 1940s. The script was written by three different writers. Much like my favorite year, it appears that there was an initial writer before the script was rewritten by alums of Brooks Films. The initial writer was Nicholas Kazan, who would later be Oscar nominated for writing Reversal of Fortune. The Brooks Films alums are Eric Berggren and Christopher DeVore of The Elephant Man. Consideration for the facts aside, it's a generally well told story, but the movie breezes through its timeline so rapidly that it's difficult to even get a hold of all the story beats. But this would seem to not be the writer's fault, but the fault of cutting the film down too much, perhaps at the studio's insistence. The film is 2 hours and 20 minutes long, but it was cut down from a several hour initial cut, and it feels like it. In today's world, this would likely be a miniseries instead of a feature film, and it should be. The film's editor, John Wright, would later be Oscar nominated for the likes of The Hunt for Red October and Speed. He has diversity in his credits, but he definitely knows how to cut together an action film. Frances is not cut up like an action film, but it is breezy. It's just too breezy. It's well constructed, but I believe Wright was limited in what he could do when he had to keep so much story into such a relatively constrained runtime. Laszlo Kovacs of Easy Rider acts as a cinematographer here, and he does a terrific job, really, of putting us into these different decades in a way that feels intimate. Legendary composer John Barry of The Lion in Winter, James Bond, Infamy, he supplies the score, which is a good one, even if it gets lost in the mess of the truncated nature of the film. Jessica Lange plays Frances Farmer, with Lange being such a rising star at this moment, having started her film career 6 years earlier with 1976's King Kong. She actually won the Oscar for Best Supporting Actress this year for Tootsie, beating out Kim Stanley, who played Farmer's mom in Frances. Stanley is good, for sure, as a stern presence in the contentious relationship that this mother and daughter had. While Lang won for Best Supporting Actress, she was also nominated for playing Frances in the Best Actress category, which went ultimately to Meryl Streep in Sophie's Choice. It's hard to feel too bad for Lang when she did win a trophy, but if you're going to lose anything, losing to Meryl Streep is the way to go. Regardless, Lang is a powerhouse, and even if aspects of the story are false, Lang is dedicated to the character. She makes it all feel so real in all of its complexity. Even edited down, as this film is, Lang steals everything, makes you understand the emotional reality of the character. No wonder Anthony Hopkins said that this was his favorite performance from an actress. If it wasn't for her performance, I don't know if the issues that I have with the film could be made up for much at all. Sam Shepard of Days of Heaven plays a character that might have been invented, who was in love with Frances. It isn't any real surprise that Shepard and Lang ultimately fell in love with each other in real life. Their chemistry on screen is evident, and both of them are accomplished performers. Shepard brings a natural, rugged charisma here, a force wanting to support Frances throughout, up until the lobotomy, when the light goes out from her. Quite literally, the cinematographer Kovacs cut the eye lights on Frances after the lobotomy. But it is nonetheless difficult to get a real sense of a lot of these relationships in the story, with the film moving so quickly through her early life to her being a cinema star to the theater, etc., all while we can eventually know that the story is covering decades of time. I'll randomly shout out Jonathan Banks in a brief scene as a hitchhiker strikes a brief conversation with Frances. Banks, of course, known to the modern audience from Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. But the film is filled with strong presences, really, and an overall handsome production. I feel like it's worth considering the harshness of psychiatric wards of that era, even if that isn't the most honest way to do it. I believe Frances Farmer was a compelling personality, even if her real story could still be served by something more honest. And I'm not even blaming the filmmakers for this as much as I am William Arnold, author of Shadowland, who started a belief that became perpetuated as truth for a while. So the filmmakers accepted these things as truth too, even if they also were interested in telling the story with all of its heightened flair. Just like my favorite year of the film was the first time feature effort for director Graham Clifford, who had edited films like Don't Look Now and The Rocky Horror Picture Show. I don't know if this was the best project for a first time director, as it is so epic and sprawling and emotionally taxing. But Clifford does a fine job generally of keeping the film tight and not feeling exploitive. He later said that they weren't after the facts, but after telling a story, which is perhaps driven as a reaction to the lawsuit more than an overall thesis for storytelling. But I nonetheless believe that the film was made with a sense of compassion for its subject, and that goes a long way. If you look at Farmer in segments after her alleged lobotomy, I feel it's even more obvious that the lobotomy is not real. Even specifically watching the real This Is Your Life segment, which was recreated in this film, I feel that there obviously is light in a real life farmer's eyes. Never mind that I find the concept of This Is Your Life to be such a bizarre way to showcase a celebrity and bring in figures from their past. It feels false and rehearsed and just generally awkward, weirdly, with the real people in it often seeming unsure of how to behave. Back to the matter at hand, though, Frances Farmer could have been an even bigger star, I'd imagine, but she also had mental issues on top of being somewhat ostracized by the industry around her, treated like a troublemaker that seemed to only further isolate her. This film might make you interested in Farmer, but it isn't truthful, although this is partially a judgment with knowledge ascertained 40 years after the film was released. As a film, it is compelling, and it's often worth watching entirely for Jessica Lange. And so, with all caveats stated, I would give the film a solid B grade. As a piece of cinema, I was interested all throughout, in spite of my frustrations. And I cared about Francis as a character. And that all goes a long way to defining a film watched after my favorite year. I couldn't help but also consider how beloved and celebrated someone like Errol Flynn was by some, even after his own rampant abuses, whereas Francis Farmer was abused and somewhat outcast. Both of them died young. Flynn, 50 years old, Farmer, 56. Neither of these movies are really about them, but it's interesting to see what happens with celebrity and the way that people perceive celebrities. So, for that purpose, these films do a lot to cause one reconsideration over history and the history of celebrity specifically. My favorite year was a modest box office success, while Francis did not do so well at the box office. On part six of the film career of Mel Brooks, we have two very different films. The first is a remake of a 1942 classic, To Be or Not to Be, with Mel Brooks and Anne Bancroft in the leading roles, putting Brooks squarely in the World War II era, ground that he certainly has touched upon in other works, but here in a comedy with dramatic touches, directed by Alan Johnson. Then, The Doctor and the Devils, directed by Freddie Francis, who was cinematographer on The Elephant Man. And I mentioned in my review of The Elephant Man that Francis had not been a cinematographer in a long time, but he had been a director. With The Doctor and the Devils, Brooks produced one of those directorial efforts based on a true story, a crime drama, and I look forward to digging into both of these films on the next Movie Marathon Mood. Thanks for watching.